Hello and welcome to a special episode of Spectator TV. We're going to be discussing the university's crisis, the impact of COVID-19 and the fate of the sector in general. I'm Fraser Nelson and I'm delighted to be joined by two former university ministers, Joe Johnson and David Willetts, who's also the author of University Education. Thank you both for joining me. Now, Joe, you wrote for The Spectator fairly recently about the peril that you thought would be facing British universities. The argument is a lot of universities get their fees from overseas students who are far likely to be at university this year. But since then, we've seen a big increase in the number of British people applying for university and being given offers due to the exams debacle. So where are we now, do you think? Are universities still in a precarious financial situation?
Well, we're waiting to find out, Fraser, because these are the critical days when we're waiting to see how many of those international students who applied actually turn up on campus and enroll and go past the critical moment of actually enrolling. So this is all to be decided all to be determined in the next few days. But you did make an important point, which is that there is a big irony in this government, which was seemingly trying to deter young people from going to university in numbers, presiding over what has been the single biggest increase in enrollment rates of 18-year-olds that we've seen probably at any single year since the Robbins report in 1963 advocated the expansion of higher education in the UK. We've seen an extraordinary leap in the enrollment rate, 2.5 percentage point jump this year versus last year, which is, as far as I can see, the biggest we've seen in many, many, many years.
Right, now the thing is that, I'd like this to put this to you, Laura Willetts, that there's been a big increase in people going to university, but a big decrease in the experience they get when they get there. No Freshers Week, but that's the least of it. It's more difficult to hang out in groups and tutorials. A lot of things are going online. So do you think that there is a problem now that university students who are under the reforms that you supported, paying up to £9,000 a year from this, not many of them are being given any discount in that fee, and yet they're getting a fraction of what they originally thought they were buying?
Well, and I just, on this, as on many other issues, I suspect Joe and I see it very similarly. Look, it is a tough time to be going to university because of all the virus restrictions. But as with school and college, the government was right to try to encourage people to go, and universities should be able to organise higher education so you can have social distancing and some real education experiences. On what sort of financial support should be offered, the fact is that these are not fees that students pay up front. So when I read all this stuff in the media, we should somehow remit the fees. What it means is that down the track, someone 20 years on, when they're in a well-paid job, will notice that their repayments at 9% above a higher threshold are finishing a couple of years earlier than they otherwise would have done, which doesn't seem to me to be a massive way of helping students now. So if there is any resource, and universities have got hardship funds, they should be doing things like helping with rents, making sure that proper services, including things like food deliveries, if students are absolutely being asked to isolate. So practical help now, not easing the pressures on well-paid graduates in 20 years' time.
When it comes to practical help, David, what about allowing them to show up to lectures? What about making a bit more effort? Many workplaces now are doing what they can to get as many people as possible back into an office environment. Universities seem to have been very uninterested in helping. I guess they've got a captive audience, young people who aren't truly going to go around the world now because you wouldn't travel in the COVID era, nor are they going to find a job when unemployment is expected to double. So it seems as if universities work out so that the young people don't have many options, and they don't seem to have tried very hard to continue the university experience.
Well, I'm sure the performance of universities varies from good to bad, but look, the government set out 4 tiers of support, and the basic model, which is what I hope most universities will get, most students, may be that the large-scale lectures are online, just because getting 300 people into a lecture theatre is incredibly difficult now. But there absolutely should be face-to-face teaching in smaller groups, in seminars and tutorials. Obviously, for students in lab-based subjects, they still need access to labs. It needs to be properly organised. And so in my experience, universities have been trying to continue to deliver real education with physical contact as well as online education in what's called blended learning. Near where I am at this moment, down in the University of Portsmouth, they've got a walk-in testing centre for students, and you go through that, you get the results quickly, and then there is a very strong education environment in the university.
Right. Joe Johnson, you're a big advocate of British universities, but I wonder if some of them will have been harming their reputation by the way that they have treated their students during the COVID. You've got some universities who've said that they're not going to have, they've basically cancelled online lectures right up until the end of, until the end of the academic year. So everything's going online, irrespective of what happenings with the virus. And I have to say that the market reforms that David Willetts and others put in there were supposed to make students into the consumers. They don't feel like consumers now.
Well, students do have protection under consumer law, and if they feel that they haven't received the kind of education that they contracted with their university to get, then there is a course of action they can go down. They can first of all make a complaint through their university, then to the adjudicator, and then ultimately, they can take their complaint to the Office for Students. But I think, on the whole, Fraser, I think these are pretty exceptional. I think the sector has made heroic efforts to adjust to the extraordinary circumstances that the virus is confronting it with. And I do generally think that the sort of clamour for refunds from the NUS and UCU on behalf of students is a bit misplaced, because tuition fees, pay for a huge amount of things which are of vital importance within a university. They pay for academic time, they pay for the expertise in teaching, but they also pay for mental health support, cleaning and maintenance, administration, library, the IT, and 100 other things. So really, I think you would suddenly start depriving a university of vital income, which they actually need right now to support students through this difficult time. They're also, because of the need to provide this hybrid form of learning, incurring additional costs which they otherwise wouldn't have. So it's far from online learning being a sort of a cut price, cheapskate way of providing higher education. It's actually significantly more expensive than doing traditional face-to-face teaching. If you think about it, distance learning involves way more way more than just recording a talk and bunging it online. It involves expensive tech, it involves expensive tech support, it involves training academics how to use it, it involves them getting it wrong first time, re-recording it. It involves them adapting content to make it work, to make it accessible and richer, and then running the interactive sessions themselves. So it actually takes far more time for an academic to prepare, a 2-hour seminar than it does to deliver it in a traditional face-to-face setting. So university costs are actually blowing up as a result of this, far from the opposite. And so they're not in a good position to kind of absorb the demands for fee reductions that we're hearing so much of at the moment.
And can I ask you, Joe Johnson, about the Office for Students? This is a fairly new innovation. The idea here is it's a kind of a quango, which famously almost contains Toby Young as its members, but not quite in the end. But they would be the sort of the student's voice. I'm wondering what role they play now to the students who say, for example, that not until they signed the lease for their accommodation were they told what exactly the online course would learn. So they're feeling aggrieved that they've had to stump up for university accommodation, basically on a false premise. And it's not clear to me that the Office for Students is in any position to help them.
Well, the Office for Students is a big improvement on what went before in this respect. I mean, previously we had a higher education regulator that very clearly was regulating in the producer interest. The Higher Education Funding Council for England, as its name suggests, saw its principal role as to funnel as much money to providers as it possibly could. And the student voice was really not heard very powerfully in HEFCE. I think, you know, under Michael Barber and Nicola Dandridge, the Office for Students is putting the student at the forefront of its thinking, and they've been leading the way, for example, in developing ideas around student contracts, in ensuring that students are represented fully in panels that are meant to assess the quality of teaching and student outcomes, and in ensuring that universities are clear with students about exactly what they can expect at the time that they apply and enroll. Of course, there's always, you know, room to go further, and I think there is a difficult balancing act that the Office for Students has to strike in a crisis such as this, when it needs also to think about sustainability of the higher education system as a whole. But I think by and large, the Office for Students is a much needed reform. It was inspired by David's white paper way back in 2011-12. I think it was called Students at the Heart of the System. Is that what it was called?
Yep.
Yep. And, you know, that set the sort of the theory for why you needed to make sure the student voice was more prominent in our regulation of higher education. And I think the Office for Students is on a journey to making that a reality.
So David Willetts, let's go with that theme, students at the heart of the system. In what way are they at the heart of the system now? In what way have we seen students or consumer demand, the power, Joe Johnson talked about the power. Has the power shifted from the providers to the users of higher education in a meaningful way? Or are they just paying a lot more money for something they would have probably got anyway?
Well, I did see the reforms that I brought in and Joe brought in as well, like the OFS, as kind of bringing in the new world to redress the balance in the old. I actually saw strengthening the power of students as, if anything, driving universities to focus more on a high quality academic experience. Because when you actually spoke to students, they weren't plotting Marxist revolution. They were complaining they didn't get their essays back in time, and they didn't see enough of the people who were doing the lectures. Those were the kind of preoccupations, and I think they still are their preoccupations. As to whether we've made any progress, I think in the last 10 years we have, and it's taken several forms. First of all, because we were also able to get rid of number controls, because we no longer had the old style model when it was a lot of public expansion, the Treasury controlled it by controlling student numbers. Universities compete for students. They compete for students on the offer that they make and also on the quality of the academic experience. And because universities can expand, if more students want to go there, more students are getting their first choice of university. So that's the first clear piece of evidence. Secondly, although it is incredibly hard to measure teaching standards in universities, because there isn't a single exam and a starting exam and a finishing exam like you have in the school system, I do buy the evidence that is coming in that, if anything, the focus on the academic standards and the quality of teaching has improved in the last 10 years. And Joe's reforms played an important part in that, because when I started back in 2010, you had this paradox of an intensely competitive regime for research funding, which was driving British university-based research to absolutely the top of the global league table, and no competition for students. You just collected a dollop of money from the Treasury and had a limit on the number of students you could take. So my view was that if anything, we were hyper competitive on research. We needed to promote a bit more collaboration. But when it came to teaching, we needed good old-fashioned competition to try to drive an increased focus on teaching. And universities are much more focused on teaching than they were.
Right, but I'm wondering, I mean, I'll give you an example, Joe Johnson, of something that happened recently that made me really wonder where the power lay. The universities, they were worried about COVID, and they asked the government to basically put a cap on places. I took that to mean that the less popular universities were worried, but the more popular universities were going to expand their places. There were going to be more places in Russell Group universities. So the best universities would have more people. That would leave fewer people for the lower tier universities. Now, the government went along with this, saying it would provide more stability for the university sector. But in what way was this really in the interests of students? Because surely something like that could only be intended to deprive students of getting the extra opportunities at the top universities that were about to be created because they feared there were fewer international students. I mean, to me, this was a straightforward, almost conspiracy against students in the interest of the sector collectively.
The short-lived return of student number controls in the way you described effectively did for a time constrain the role that student choice plays in determining the size and shape of the sector. And I'm glad that it was a short-lived experiment, and that thankfully the number controls were removed again pretty rapidly. You know, I think that you can see why government acceded to the sector's request that they return in circumstances we found ourselves in, namely that, you know, some universities feared there would be a scramble for students, and that students, regardless of the quality of their universities, regardless of the quality of their provision, might find themselves in extreme financial difficulties and risk disorderly failure. And that would be an undesirable situation for students themselves at that institution and for the system and reputation of UK higher education as a whole. So you can see why government was tempted to restore student number controls for a bit. I'm very glad that in reality, international student applications were such that the government felt able to lift those number controls again. And we've now got, you know, student choice playing its full role in the size and shape of the sector from next year onwards. I think that's a good thing. So the sector can continue to respond to competition, to, you know, the signals that the universities are sending out about where high quality teaching and research are and can be found.
Fraser, can I add one comment on that? I mean, I very much agree with what Joe said, but also to come back to your reference to lower tier universities and all that. A problem which we're all complicit in is if, when we say leading universities, top universities, higher tier universities, the most powerful single evidence we are thinking of is research quality and research performance. That's and on that, we can measure whether you are kind of getting published in the most prestigious international journals, and we can see the universities that are. Every time we rank universities solely on the measure of research, we are rewarding behavior in which universities focus on their effort on research rather than on teaching. And it reaches the point where, if you were trying to look at this from a narrow economic perspective, it is rational for an individual student to settle for not having much teaching, knowing that the resource they bring in is going on research, if that pushes the university up the research rankings, which means every in turn values their degree more highly. So if we all, in day-to-day media comment, play up the model, the only ranking of universities is research performance, we make the problem that you worry about worse, because and Joe's TEF was anything that enables us also to remind people that there are less prestigious universities that may also be doing well on teaching, and that teaching matters, helps tackle the problem you're rightly worried about.
Right, but David, but isn't it, I mean, sure, we talk about higher tier and lower tier, and you're right, there are university ranking systems, and there's a whole lot more to what an undergraduate gets from a university than simply how the university is ranked in research. But if you also look at the most popular universities and the least popular, the ones that charge the full £9,000, the ones that charge less, there is a broad overlap. And it wasn't the whole purpose of your market reforms that the most popular universities would be allowed to expand and that less popular universities would not. And to put it this way, some of them might actually go bust, because if they were doing courses that weren't really serving students or society and weren't in demand, then they ought to be allowed to go bust, because that is what the market does.
Correct. That is the logic of the system. And absolutely, when the student choice matters. And I began a process, and Joe took it a lot further, getting more information out there for prospective students, including insofar as it could be measured, teaching quality measured through student satisfaction, more empirical measures as well. So yeah, I wanted the student choice to drive the system of teaching, but equally, I want the student choice to be informed by evidence and views on teaching, not just on research. And my frustration with the system we've got is we've still got at the back of everyone's head a kind of ranking of a good university versus a bad university, which is heavily shaped by research performance, not teaching performance.
Right. Joe Johnson, we haven't, it's funny that when the universities do, say the less popular ones, however you want to describe it, when there is concern that they are going to come under financial pressure, this tends to be seen now as a bad thing. But why should that be so? Why shouldn't it be the case that the most popular universities expand the number of places? Because when David Willetts et al. Made their reforms, it wasn't just the introduction of fees, it was the lifting of the cap. The lifting of the cap was a really fundamental change. And this is one of the reasons, correct me if I'm wrong, that we see a lot more students from poorer backgrounds going to university nowadays.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, no, the sector has expanded very significantly, Fraser, since the student number controls were lifted progressively from 2013 onwards. And that shows up in the increased enrollment rate of 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds in particular. Many more young people are going to university as a result of the expansion of universities, and some of them have almost doubled in size. I mean, the likes of Bristol and Exeter, they're almost unrecognizable. Some universities have grown so much they've kind of swallowed the towns around them. The sector certainly has expanded. Your question is, why don't we let universities fail when they fail the test of the market and cease to see demand for their courses? Well, occasionally you do see consolidations of institutions and you see closure of programs and closure of courses. It happens that this has been a very strong period of growth in higher education over the last 8 or 9 years. And, institutions by and large haven't been under extreme financial stress. But I think philosophically, both David and I recognize that there might be circumstances in which a university would want to merge or be consolidated with another, close a program. And personally, I was always fairly sanguine about that prospect. I thought the sector couldn't be preserved in aspic and never had been. We have about 160 universities in the country at the moment. This is a new phenomenon. For several hundred years, there was just Oxford and Cambridge in England and St Andrews and so on in Scotland.
And Glasgow.
The sector has grown and expanded. And there've been mergers and consolidations along the way as the sector has expanded. So I didn't see preserving it in aspic as part of the duties of government. I thought we needed to facilitate an environment in which student choice could shape the sector and allow students to gravitate towards where they felt they were going to get the best outcomes for themselves.
Right.
Yeah. Sorry, Fraser. Sorry if I may add 2 comments to Joe's observations. First, I was working for Mrs. T in the mid-80s when she was at the height of her powers in the policy unit. And in 1986, a university college in Cardiff went bust and was due to close. Ken Baker, the education secretary, came around and persuaded Mrs. T that the university college had to be rescued and a merger was organized. So the politics of literally padlocks at the gates, tumbleweed blowing across the campus, weeping students outside because the whole thing is closed down, has always been quite tricky. Where I think what is missing from the debate so far, I think, if you tried to take the market model, and we're talking, this is not like a proper, completely free market, but there's clearly competition, and we're talking about a version of bankruptcy, takeover also matters. And one of my frustrations is that our higher education system is still a closed system. There are big international chains, none of them sadly British, but there are big university chains, Indian-based, American-based, Spanish-based, Chinese-based. They would love to buy an English higher education institution. So as well as the assumption that they just close in some closed system model, there is an international market out there. And another challenge, I think one of the issues over the next few years is whether overseas investors will be allowed in some way to take these over and turn them around.
Right, but I suppose that it's funny, Joe Johnson, and that some of the, let's take the Ivy League. Now, Stanford University, I remember recently, was issued something like a 100-year bond. Here was an institution so financially secure, but it was able to raise its own money by borrowing at quite a low interest rate from the market, because nobody could imagine any circumstances in the next 100 years where Stanford University could be in any serious amount of financial trouble, such as the confidence in the financial prospects of a world-beating university. Now, Britain probably has more world-beating universities per capita than any other country in the world. If you look at how many top 50 universities we've got, I forget, it's something like about a dozen or something, where no Eurozone country has even got one. So yes, we do very well in it. So the Conservatives have tended to be the party that have done their best to help the higher education sector grow. But I wonder if COVID has shown a pretty big challenge to that if you get, this is the kind of black swan event where all of a sudden we can't rely on people coming from overseas in as many numbers to universities. And we're already beginning to see, this Conservative government has dropped the demand to get, or the target to get 50% of young people into university. So I wonder if we're so sure really that the tide, the future will necessarily involve more money and more business to universities, or whether it might have seemed that way 5 or 6 years ago, but things look different now, especially after the virus struck.
Well, I mean, you're right. This has been a real test of the model for our universities' finances. Many institutions have become very dependent on international student fee income to put on high-cost courses. That this fee income plays a big part in several cross-subsidies in our model. The subsidy primarily is to research. A significant amount of funding from international students goes straight into our science system. And that's why there would be real damage to our capabilities as an R&D nation if we decided or if we saw a sustained fall off in international student numbers. But there's also a subsidy into high cost courses, whether they're lab based or studio based, which affects the courses that are available to domestic students. So it's like having a hub airport, in the sense that the fact that we've got international students coming in makes it possible for universities to offer courses that would otherwise be loss-making, and therefore they increase the choice available to our domestic student population. So this model is under stress. I personally think this is, it's the international students play a vital part in sustaining the richness of our university environment. They not only do those two things that I mentioned, increasing the choice available to domestic students and putting more money than we otherwise would into our science base, but they also enable our students to study in a diverse environment. And I really think we sometimes underestimate how crucial that is. I often hear people say, well, why do we have so many Chinese students in our universities? And isn't there a lack of diversity on campus? I think we're getting this the wrong way around. We should genuinely celebrate the fact that Chinese students want to come and study here, because boy, are we going to need to understand China and the worldview of Chinese people in years to come. And in 5-10 years' time, when the Chinese higher education system has developed even more than it has already, we may not see these flows in such numbers as we do today. And I think we will regret quibbling over the numbers of Chinese students that we now benefit from and see on our campuses. And ditto the numbers of Indian students and students from other countries around the world. It's a real privilege for our young people to be able to study in this diverse environment and to learn from people and their different perspectives on our global challenges. And I think that's a critical message which we all need to understand.
Yeah. David Willetts, sometimes it's said that if you compare a British degree to an Ivy League one, the £9,000 a year is really quite cheap. Take, for example, somebody who went to an expensive private school, who went to Oxford or Cambridge, they could be paying £25,000, £30,000 a year for the private school, yet they only are paying £9,000 for their Oxbridge or Cambridge course, even if it costs actually a lot more to run. Now, why should somebody like that, it's argued, be subsidized? Is there the potential to increase the fees further, at least for families who can afford it? And maybe we ought to be looking at the way that the Americans do, about just simply about liberalizing or lifting the controls on what universities charge, to allow them to be better financed. So what are your thoughts about that in the future of a 9,000 a year cap? Now that you're out of the House of Commons, you can perhaps tell us what you really think.
I always try to say what I really thought, always under certain constraints, yeah. The trouble, of course, those kind of options are looked at. There are, I think the means test, and you're saying, well, should rich students pay more? The best way you can operate the means test is through the graduate repayment system, where essentially people who end up in well-paid jobs pay back a lot. And if for whatever reason you're not in a well-paid job, you don't pay back so much. So we have got a kind of means test in the system and I think at the right point. We have looked at options of allowing some universities to charge even higher fees. And Oxford and Cambridge certainly could and have pressed for that freedom. The difficulty is that you'd actually have a kind of reverse pupil premium effect. You would find that the resources going into the most prestigious universities were also, I have to say, also socially the most selective, those would go up, and you'd have a further problem at the other end of the system. So it was hard to work out an actual practical way in which you could do this in a way that was equitable, and you'd have ended up having to put more public money in at the other end, probably the universities that take more kids from poor backgrounds, take more kids from black and minority ethnic groups, all those type of challenges. The lower tier, as you call them, they're actually often taking on students who, if they were secondary schools, would enable them to get extra resource through the pupil premium.
And did you find it depressing, David Willetts, after you liberalised the reforms, universities became a lot more commercial? It wasn't that long before we saw the pay of those right at the top of the university hierarchy go up quite a lot. We started to see sort of reserves of cash being built up. It started to look pretty early on as if this was leading to the transfer of resources to a new and better paid administrative class of universities.
Well, there was some of that, and it caused a lot of controversy, understandably, especially if the procedures and the governance weren't right. I mean, in other words, if it didn't look as if these were pay decisions being taken properly, independently of the people involved. So yeah, there was hard feeling about it. I have to say, in general, though, my experience was that the money from the fees did go into services for students. And just to go through the gory details, because of, say, capital spending, and we've had the Prime Minister today, and I think it's great, announcing more public expenditure on capital for FE colleges. There used to be a public capital budget for universities, for teaching facilities. A tiny bit of it survives. We got rid of most of it as part of the cuts in 2010. And I can still remember the conversations with the Treasury, because I said, look, universities do need to build new stuff. And they said, right, now they're going to have this income from fees. They can use it to service the debt as they undertake commercial borrowing. We're shifting from public money funding capital to using their income from fees to service the borrowing so that they can have capital expenditure. We had a lot of programs to help disadvantaged students, which have now become a claim on the 9K fees. So a lot of the money went in that way, much more went in that way than on Vice Chancellor's pay.
Right. Now, we're also going to take questions from those watching us as well. I've got a question here from James. This is to you, Joe Johnson. How do you see, are there indications of how COVID is going to affect students' grades? Can we see any grade inflation? I did see somewhere, I think it was Magdalen College in Oxford, that was increasing the proportion of people who had firsts to a quite alarming degree.
Well, there is, I think, first of all, before we get to the issue of grade inflation, I think we're going to see a real risk of an inflation in the rate at which students drop out. And that's my actually bigger concern right now.
Interesting. Why so?
Well, you know, the transition from school to university is a big one. There's a big gap in the style of learning, the pace of learning. And for many people, particularly for kids from disadvantaged backgrounds, that gap is already a challenge. In the context of the difficult learning environment of the last 6 months in secondary schools, that gap is going to be bigger than ever. And I think the real focus that the Office for Students and the sector as a whole needs to have right now is on those students starting their first year, when they're going to feel overwhelmed by many pressures right now. And I feel a very significant focus needs to be given to pastoral support, to teaching support and learning support, so that those students don't drop out. Across the system in a normal year, Fraser, you see about 6 or 7% of students drop out. And normally that's at the end of the first term or at some point in the first year. I worry very much that this number will be significantly higher this year. First of all, because we've seen a very significant increase, as I mentioned earlier, in the proportion of people entering higher education, and that increase has principally come, or to a very significant extent come, from pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds, from families without a traditional history of sending young people to university. And second, because of the extraordinary environment that we're now in over the last 6 months. So for me, yes, degree inflation is a real problem, and the sector's been terribly remiss in not getting to grips with it and letting it run out of control and letting it devalue the currency of an English higher education qualification. And it's a huge regret that that's happened. But I don't think that's as big a policy priority as dealing with the risk of non-continuation or dropouts.
Okay. We've got a question now from David to you, David Willetts. To what extent has the expansion of student numbers diminished the value of normal standard first degrees in the eyes of employers? I guess this is quite an old and quite familiar question, but certainly, you know, when I was young, I was the first member of my family ever to go to university, and it was to actually have it was very rare in those days. It's a lot less rare now. We've got a lot more people with degrees, and nobody would deny this is a far better thing than having only the richest 7%, 10% of students with degrees. But isn't it an undeniable corollary of that to have a degree no longer quite sets you apart as it once did? So it's harder to say, as I think your government did at the time, if you get a degree, you're likely to earn X amount more than you would if you didn't have a degree, simply because the more you increase the number of people with degrees, the less value employers are going to place on those degrees. And all of a sudden, the difference between a graduate and a non-graduate, or somebody who did an apprenticeship, becomes far more blurred than it would have been before the expansion of student numbers started to take place 7 or 8 years ago.
Well, there is some of the phenomena you describe. I mean, it's one of many drivers in the system. But look, throughout the growth, you say in the last 7 or 8 years, if you take the long trend, back in the days of Robbins, it was 5%. We're now on about 50%. And at every stage of that process, people have raised your concern. You know, there's the graduate premium is going to diminish. What's the point of going to university? There should be a restraint on this growth. But I think in overall, the extraordinary phenomenon is how the graduate premium has held up despite this massive growth. Now, it does look as if in the last few years, there's been, if anything, a slight diminution of that graduate premium, but it's still there. And we don't know to what extent that's just shaped by the poor performance of the labour market overall since the crash of 2008-9. Indeed, the work we've done at Resolution Foundation and elsewhere suggests, if anything, what's happened, there was an increase in unemployment post that crash, and non-graduates tended to be unemployed. Graduates traded down into some non-graduate jobs, so they did better on employment, but indeed, graduate earnings on average didn't do quite so well, but they're still way ahead of non-grads. So I still think there's an underlying trend for advanced economies, by and large, to need people with more years of education. I see that as a trend over the last 150 years, as a trend in other advanced Western countries. And as we saw this summer, trying to be King Canute, holding back that surge of young people into education, including higher education, is a very uncomfortable position to be in.
All right. On that note, here's a question from Sophie to you, Joe Johnson. Is there a concern that the exams debacle, whereby a lot of people were given the exams that they were predicted, and we saw a huge increase in the number of A's and B's given versus last year, will mean a lot of people have been given places at university who will struggle to cope? And this comes back to your point about dropouts. So the dropout will happen simply because the government, in a panic, has allocated a lot of university places to people who would struggle to cope academically at the pace in which they're now going to learn. And that's, as she puts it, that the government's short-term fix could quickly turn into a longer-term problem.
Well, I think there is certainly a risk of, as I said, students dropping out in higher than usual numbers this year, and that phenomenon the question describes it may play a part in it. If students are being admitted into courses which they may struggle on, and I think that puts the real onus on the sector to take responsibility for students. Once, universities take great pride in being autonomous in their admissions. It's one of the sort of the tenets of our system that government doesn't interfere in university admissions. But if you claim that autonomy, you've got to take the responsibility that comes with it. And I think that means that when you admit a student, you've then got to ensure they don't drop out, and that you provide them with the support at every stage in their journey through to graduation and beyond. So I think universities really have to really step up now and take responsibility. They've admitted students in large numbers, and they need to make sure that they get through their courses.
Okay. Here's a question from Edward to you, and David Willetts. Will the move to virtual learning, first of all, diminish the opportunities for networking at university, and therefore, secondly, social mobility? I guess that the idea is at university, you might come from a poor background, you might come from what we call the polar 5 areas, least likely to send people to university. But you would mix, you go to clubs and societies, you would mix with people on like-minded people, and you'd be able to do social mobility through campus. If there isn't the same mixing due to COVID, and people are being cooped up in their rooms, is the social mobility aspect likely to be hit by the restrictions that universities are now imposing?
Yeah, I do worry about that. I think it's not a unique problem in universities. I think it's a wider problem. And in fact, Joe, Fraser, myself, we probably all have a similar experience at our stage of careers. When you used to do events and give a talk or give a lecture, and some keen young people would come up afterwards and ask you some questions, and you'd try to give them some advice. I think the moment when you press the leave the meeting button at the end of the presentation, without that extra 5 or 10 minutes afterwards for people, often younger people, to come and talk to you, is a real loss. And there's a similar phenomenon in higher education. So it is a risk. It's absolutely true. It's a risk. I think that's probably one of the reasons why universities were so keen, if at all possible, at least to get people onto campus. Even if the lecture was online, there was been attempts to, in a socially distanced environment, provide opportunities for students still to mix. That's why they want that to happen. And also there's some really smart work going on by experts in the digital economy at ways in which you can create virtual equivalents of those informal arrangements, including sort of random lotteries whereby you link up people in the same institution, the same university, the same department, who might have had a gossip in the queue at the coffee machine, and instead find themselves randomly linked up. So yes, it is a problem, and through maintaining campus environment and digital innovation, I hope it can be overcome.
Okay. And Joe Johnson, another question here. Do you think that if universities have learned the art of beaming their lectures now to people in their student halls, the same technology could beam these lectures and the learning experience to students right around the world? And now these foreign students that you mentioned, they could be given a sort of quasi-open university experience, because universities, if they're doing their job properly, will be learning the tools of how to replicate that as much as they can digitally. So might this turn out to be not the calamity for education, higher education that you envisage, but a massive technological revolution and a genuine opportunity to go global?
Yeah, that's a very interesting way of thinking about it. And of course, that's right. Technology does expand the market for our world-class higher education significantly. And universities will be able to tap into segments of populations that don't want the full fat 3 to 4 year courses or 1 to 2 year master's courses overseas in another country, and they will be able to slice and dice courses to appeal to those income segments below those that have traditionally taken advantage of opportunities to study overseas. So I think that certainly is an opportunity, but I don't think it will displace the traditional model of international higher education that Britain, Canada, the US, Australia, New Zealand have dominated over the last few decades. I think there will always be a demand for traditional face-to-face, fully immersive experience overseas, because higher education is a bundle of things. It's not just the teaching, it's the network, it's the labor market opportunities, either in the study destination country or what studying overseas adds to your qualifications when you return to your home country. And for many people, it's that bundle of things, the networking, the labor market experience, the living overseas, the language acquisition, that are actually just as important as the pedagogical content of any course, which, as you say, can, to some greater degree or other, now be delivered by other means, remotely or online or virtually or whatever. So I do think, I certainly see it in a positive frame, that this expands the market for our world-class higher education, and our most astute institutions are taking full advantage of that.
Thank you. Well, any other questions, do send them through on the chat function in Zoom. Another question from Edward to you, David Willetts. Can you comment on the value of university alternatives such as apprenticeships? Because over the last few years, you now quite often see very prestigious secondary schools as very expensive ones. They will announce not only have they got X many kids to Bristol, to Durham, to Oxford, to Cambridge, but they might also say, and by the way, we've got 2 students on an apprenticeship for Jaguar Land Rover or something like that. They seem to be as proud as that as they are of getting into the universities in the old days. So it seems that apprenticeships are being certainly seen to be as glittering a prize as a place at some of the best universities.
Yeah, I mean, I think an apprenticeship at Jaguar Land Rover is a fantastic thing to do. So great for people who get it. The issue, I don't think, is the prestige of apprenticeships. It's when you think of apprenticeships like that, the supply is quite limited. An apprenticeship is an actual employer wishing to employ a young person, then invest in their education and training. And I think it's no accident you think of not conventional, but established manufacturing firms. That's the kind of environment where we think of the apprenticeship. They're great, but they just aren't going to get the volume that is required unless we massively changed our labour market. It's no accident that higher education participation is particularly high in liberal market economies with relatively unregulated labour markets. If you go down the German route, with many more protected activities, many more licenses to practice that you need to secure through an apprenticeship, and you can't do this job unless you've done an apprenticeship and reached the following requirement. You can't call yourself an electrician or whatever. Then you reverse a lot of our labour market changes, and you can create an environment where there are many more protected jobs and apprenticeships. So my view has always been that it's not anyone who's against apprenticeships. Throughout my adult political career, successive governments have announced incredibly ambitious targets for them, but you just don't have the number of employers and the number of protected careers where an apprenticeship is a prior requirement to be able to match Germany's volume.
Okay. Now, Joe Johnson, you're talking there about how you'd like to see universities do more in the pastoral care of students, especially those from deprived backgrounds who might otherwise be dropping out. We do hear quite a lot from government increasingly about what they would like universities to do, and as government provides a lot of the financial support, government's in a pretty decent position to call these shots. I wonder if there ought also to be pressure to universities to open up. If they've got, again, I mean, earlier on we spoke about sharing online lessons in the context of international students, but you could also make it more accessible for domestic students. So people who would quite like to learn, or at least to see what it is like to see a history lecture at Oxford or or a zoology lecture at Bristol, you could actually say to them, we would like you to do more to make these openly accessible. If you're going to be recording these things, why have them in a closed circuit to your students? Why not let them be shared more openly and therefore promote greater equality of access, if not to the degree, then at least to the educational experience?
No, I think there's a lot to that, and I think one of the silver linings of the coronavirus was the energy that the Department for Education put into making available online resources that previously weren't. So, BBC played its part. Many universities and education providers of one form or other collaborated in making content available that otherwise wouldn't have been.
But that was pretty ropey content, wasn't it? I mean, we know that, for example, a lot of the private schools went digital. A lot of those private schools could have been sharing their lessons because it's for exactly the same curriculum, for the same GCSEs, for the same A levels, but they didn't. They kept it all closed circuit. And if you wanted to go online, sure, what you got in the BBC was better than nothing. But there still seems to be this idea that, yes, we've got the tech to send it to a small number of people, but we choose not to send it to more people, even though we could. So the technical opportunity of expanding the availability of this incredibly precious resource, the principles that founded the Open University, seem not to be there. And I'm wondering if they need to be given a little bit of a nudge by government to widen, to share a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very interesting question as to why publicly funded higher education providers don't make more of their content generally available now that technology enables them to do so. And there is a sort of a fetishization of selectivity in our system. And I guess the fear is that once content becomes available to a mass audience, that sort of aura of selectivity will be diminished. And I think that's perhaps part of why universities don't share as much of their content as they might. On the other hand, I think everyone is relatively new to this business. I think many universities will probably be open to it over time once they've mastered all of the arts of curating online content and maintaining it, and worked out a way of paying for expensively curated and maintained online content. I don't think this is a question of goodwill in the long run. If they can find a way of funding, a way of keeping it available and maintained to be more broadly accessed in the future.
And Joe, in your Spectator article, you were talking about a potential 7 billion hit to the sector. That wasn't your figure. You quoted somebody else who calculated it. And are you now, and you write it's all up in the air now, but I take it you're feeling a lot less pessimistic, given that we've seen the young people have got so few options that they're going to university anyway. And this may prove, yeah. I mean, the funny thing is that you and me might think that if they're locked up in their halls, this might diminish the appetite for university, but it doesn't seem to. So It seems that the universities might ride out the storm after all.
Yeah, no, I think it's that 7 billion figure was a number that Universities UK put out as a sort of a scare figure in early discussions with the Treasury, and it didn't scare the Treasury very much. The Treasury said, come back later when we know what the situation is, which was the appropriate response in hindsight. It did look as though they were playing rather hardball at the time, but in hindsight, the Treasury called it absolutely right. We don't yet know, though, however, as I said, how many international students are actually going to enroll right now, and that will still determine the financial position of a few universities at the margin. But the situation is infinitely better than it appeared back in March, partly, as you say, because domestic enrollments have been so strong this year because of the exam situation and the way universities were compelled to admit everybody to whom they made offers.
Okay. David Willetts, a question for you. What was your biggest mistake as Universities Minister? I don't think you're getting out of this, Joe. We're going to come back to you. But David first, what was your biggest mistake? Come on, you guys are both out of party. Nobody's going to be voting for you again. You can tell us.
Right. I'll offer you two mistakes. I'm sure there are many more as well. That immediately spring to mind. First of all, saying early on that there would be price competition. when you think about it, given it's a graduate repayment system where the students are not paying up front, a student who had said, I would have gone to York, but it was 8,750, and I was decided instead to go to Leeds because it was 7,500, would have been acting in a very peculiar way, because they weren't actually having to write a check for an extra 1,250. It's all a graduate repayment scheme. So suggesting there would be price competition in that way was a mistake. I wanted competition for students and I wanted an open system, but it wasn't going to be price competition. I think that was a mistake. And the second thing that I regret, where things just didn't play out as I expected, was the decline in the number of adult learners. I mean, we actually extended loans to adult learners, hoping that they would take them up. And many fewer took them up than we expected. So for that reason and other reasons, big decline in public sector opportunities for people to train up, we had a decline in the number of mature students. And oddly enough, I think one of the things Boris is after in his announcement today is to try to get people to think of university as not just an experience for an 18 or 19-year-old, who incidentally are the people who are likeliest to want the physical experience of leaving home and going to a campus. It's also an opportunity for people through their adult lives when the opportunity of online learning and the digital revolution may be much more relevant. So I would have, those are my two mistakes to start off with.
Well, they're very interesting, especially, I guess, and it was said initially that it was going to be a cap of up to, and a cap at £9,000. So technically, you could have envisaged at the time some people saying 8 or 7 or 6 or 5. Your point is that to the students, that's much of a muchness, because earlier on we were discussing whether students should receive a refund. And you were saying that, well, what's the point in that? Because the refund would just be you be paying back a tiny little bit less in about 20 years' time. So I see how the range in prices didn't work out in the way that you'd thought. But similarly, I guess that means you also didn't work out the extent to which so many of them would just go straight to the full 9,000 immediately.
Well, we had an expectation that what we thought, and this is now ancient history, but what we thought was that there would be two bunches. There was a sort of differential regulatory regime above 6,000. We thought some universities so you weren't going to get competition on the last 500 or 1,000. We thought it might be worthwhile a university saying, come to us for 5,750. We thought at that point, even though it's still a graduate repayment scheme, people would see that as a significantly shorter period of repayments. So we ended up expecting that. And one or two universities tried it. I think Coventry tried it. But what did surprise me is that didn't attract a group of students either when we thought we would. But you know, this is student choice, and good for them. And the lesson I learned from all this is it's very hard to prescribe what students will want to do, and there's just a hunger out there for higher education, and the appetite keeps on growing.
Well, we've given Joe Johnson a long time to think of his answer to this question. So go on, Joe. The confessional is open. What was your greatest mistake and then in the many times you served as university minister?
I mean, apart from when I launched a competition for the public naming of a polar research vessel, without knowing what the answer would be in advance, and got given Boaty McBoatface. Now, apart from that, and apart from somehow being persuaded that it would be a good idea to appoint someone to the board of the OFS.
Someone certain close to the pages of the Spectator magazine, is that right?
Apart from those two things.
Wait, who tried to persuade you, Joe? Was it your elder brother, perhaps?
I think no. Apart from those things, my biggest mistake, I think, was probably not pushing hard enough, to be honest, to get rid of a very technical rule that's been an absolute disaster, which is the so-called equivalent or lower qualification rule. Now, Fraser, this is so arcane, you may not know what it is, but this is an insane rule that says if you're an adult, you can't take a qualification if it's equivalent or lower to one you already possess. And this has been the bane of our efforts to reskill and enable adults to retrain and reskill during their working lives, because if they've already done a particular degree, they can't do another one at an equivalent or a lower qualification. Now, we made a tiny bit of progress when we got it lifted with respect to equivalent or lower qualifications in STEM subjects, which was progress, but it's still in place generally. And it's one of the reasons why, as David mentioned, we've seen such a catastrophic fall in the numbers of people undertaking part-time courses in this country, because many of the people taking these part-time courses are adult learners and they can't do it at an equivalent or lower level than they presently have, and we've got to get rid of it.
Okay, important point. I thought for a moment, Joe, you were going to say that your mistake was deciding to stand down as a politician, because think of the fun you could be having. Do you ever turn on the TV and think, actually, I could be in that chamber? I wonder if I made the right choice.
Well, look, you got to live life looking forward, and no regrets.
No regret. Well, on that note, let us all reach for the leave meeting button that David said is rather depressing to click. It's been great to have you with Joe Johnson, David Willetts. Thanks very much indeed. Thanks for watching. And now let's all click red button leave.